What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be ranking the albums of the legendary death metal band Asphyx. Asphyx are a Netherlands-based band that were formed in 1987. The most notable founding member from their formation was drummer Bob Bagchich. He would soon be joined by guitarist Eric Daniels, and after a few demos, vocalist Martin Van Drunen would join the band, having just departed the band Pestilence. The group would then sign to Century Media Records and release their 1991 debut, The Rack. I say this a lot on this channel, but I think what really strikes me about The Rack is that the band's core sound was clearly already on display here. This record has a lot of really powerful groovy riffs, which would kind of become the trademark for Asphyx moving forward. I think you especially hear that on the first proper track, Vermin, which is just a fantastic song with so many great groovy riffs in the context of an old school death metal pummeling. There's definitely a reason this song is a live staple to this day. You also have some straight ahead bangers on this album with an almost punky feeling at times, like on the song Wasteland of Terror. Then, as is typical for Asphyx, you have plenty of doomier segments as well, like on portions of The Sickening Dwell and Evocation. I also really like how some of these doomier segments incorporate some more like mournful sounding ideas, which is pretty neat, especially in the context of an old school death metal album. I think the biggest difference between The Rack and their newer albums is just how much more raw this record is. The production is definitely pretty rough around the edges with just a really ragged guitar tone. Martin Van Drunen also sounds powerful and just feral with his trademark high register rasp. He's one of my favorite death metal vocalists, and his performance here is a great example as to why. While I don't think The Rack is as atmospheric as some of their other records, I do like some of the atmospheric ideas they bring in, like on the instrumental track Ode to a Nameless Grave, which feels quite desolate. Then you have the closing title track, which incorporates some of the ambient ideas from the opening instrumental, and I think that really ties the album together well as a whole. To me, The Rack just kind of feels like a young and scrappier version of Asphyx. They would definitely tighten up and polish their sound a bit, but this album does have a good bit of variety, and I think there's a reason why it's still so renowned. For me, honestly, this album just really resonates with me. It's got everything that makes them great in a very raw format, and it honestly could be my favorite Asphyx album. This is an A++ certified skull crusher in my book. Wasting no time, Asphyx would return in 1992 with their second album, Last One on Earth. So there were no lineup changes following The Rack, but there was already some inter-band turmoil brewing. Apparently, Martin Van Drunen only did vocals on Last One on Earth because the label wanted him to. From what I read in interviews, the other members of the band actually wanted someone else to do vocals. Nonetheless, this is still regarded as one of the band's best albums, so I really don't think that inner turmoil really hurt the sound at all on this album. The production, much like The Rack, is still raw on this record, but it's also much thicker with a huge bass that adds some real heft to these tracks. The songs themselves of this album are definitely pretty similar to what you heard on The Rack, but I think there's a little bit more influence from like Florida death metal creeping in on this record. Food for the Ignorant, for example, has some really belligerent riffs that honestly could have come from Deicide. As is typical for Asphyx, there's plenty of groovy stuff here too. The opening track, MS Bismarck, for example, explodes right in with this groovy riff. I love the swaggering ideas on this song too. The closing track, Asphyx Forgotten War, also has some great grooves and some really big, crunchy, and pounding riffs that end the album in fine form. Again, there's also some fast bangers here, like the song Serenade in Lead, which is one of my personal favorites. And I would say quality-wise, the tracks here are on par, if not better, than the first album. The Crusher, for example, has some mighty riffs with these strange and sludgy notes. The one thing I will say about the song is I do think it's a little bit long, but that's pretty much my only quibble. The title track has some fat chugs and elegant leads. And then I like the song The Incarnation of Lust, which has some peppy drum beats and molten tremolos and twisted riffing all combined together in a way that kind of reminds me of what Pinnacle would start doing. One of the things Martin Van Drunen stressed in interviews was that Asphyx are a band that focuses first and foremost on writing songs, and I think you really hear that on these first two albums. The band definitely don't write the most complex death metal out there, but when you hear an Asphyx song, a lot of times there is a signature riff or a signature hook that really draws you in, and I don't think you can say that about a lot of other death metal bands. You definitely hear that on this album as you did on The Rack. In terms of ranking, this one is super close to the debut for me, pretty much neck and neck. But I think just due to personal preference, I do prefer The Rack's just kind of rawer and more unhinged approach. Even if I think Last One on Earth, I could totally understand why somebody would consider that one the better album. Alright, so following Last One on Earth, we'd have some lineup changes in the band, with only guitarist Eric Daniels remaining in the group. A gentleman named Ron Von Paul would replace Martin Van Drunen on vocals and also take up the bass guitar. And with Bob Bagchich leaving, a gentleman named Sander Van Hoof would join on drums. And with this lineup, the band would record and release their self-titled third album in 1994. This record is pretty different from the prior albums because it's a much doomier album overall. The opening instrumental, Prelude of the Unhonored Funeral, even sounds more like something you'd hear from like an early Paradise Lost record. I think that's really driven home by the echoing leads and spoken word you hear in this track. But even on the proper songs, you have a lot of these tracks really dominated by sluggish riffing that's slower than most of the material on the first two albums. I do have to say, I don't think this type of riffing really works for me. I'm not a huge Doom fan in the first place, but on this album in particular, a lot of these riffs and ideas just kind of drag for me and feel like they don't really go anywhere or do much. I'm also really not a big fan of the vocals on this album. Ron Von Paul is pretty much a total 180 from Martin Van Drunen, whereas Martin has a high register rasp that's pretty charismatic. Ron Von Paul just kind of has this low, garbled death growl that almost sounds like John Tardy from Obituary on Quaaludes. This is also a really long album at over an hour in length, and it feels unnecessarily long to me. Valleys in Oblivion, for example, feels like it should have been the closing track. It has a really epic finish. But then after this track, you have the song Thoughts of an Atheist, which just kind of feels a little superfluous to me. There are definitely some positives here. I like the thick bass guitar sound on this album. There's some really nice groovy riffs at times, like on the song Depths of Eternity. There's also some cool solos on this album, like on the song Till Death Do Us Apart. I also got to mention the song Initiation of the Ossuary, which has some choir vocals that are overlaid with the heavy guitars to make for an almost gothic metal sounding feel. I think that conjures a pretty neat atmosphere that you didn't really hear on the two prior albums. That said, the only real track I like in full here is the instrumental track Abomination Echoes, which is also the shortest song at around 3 minutes. Most of the other tracks here are 5 minutes or longer, which honestly I think it's just a little too long for a lot of these songs. This album is definitely one of those that's a little in one ear and out the other to me. If you like Death Doom, I think you would probably enjoy it more. For me personally, even in the Death Doom genre, I've heard way better stuff. This definitely goes at the not for me tier. I could see why people would enjoy it, but yeah, this ain't an album I really love that much. All right, so following the self-titled album, we would have another major lineup change. Eric Daniels would actually leave the band, and original drummer Bob Bagchis would return, and with him he would bring guitarist, vocalist, and bassist Theo Lumens. Theo actually wasn't a complete stranger to Asphyx. He was actually the bassist and vocalist for the band during the demo years before the Rack. Together, these two would record and release the band's fifth album, which came out in 1996 and was entitled God Cries. From what I understand, Theo primarily wrote this album, and it really sounds like nothing else in their catalog to me. Generally, this is a much faster record with really no doomy moments at all. Songs like Died Yesterday and Slaughtered in Sodom almost sound more like death thrash. You do still have some of the trademark grooves and mighty riffs like you hear on the title track and on the song It Awaits. I also like some of the outside the box moments you get on this album too, like on My Beloved Enemy, which has some colorful riffs that kind of have a little bit of emotion to them, which I don't think you necessarily heard anything like that on the previous albums. That said, God Cries definitely isn't considered one of the better Asphyx albums, and I can totally understand why. For one, Theo's vocals are not particularly great to me. His performance is kind of a hoarse shout that kind of sounds like he's trying to do what Martin Van Drunen was doing on the first two albums, but just doesn't quite achieve that. The production on this record is also a little wonky with almost some squishy sounding drums. The other thing too is the songs here definitely still aren't as good as their two first albums. I think the bottom line for this record is that if you like Death Doom, the self-titled is probably more for you. If you like death thrash, God Cries is definitely more for you. It's a fun and energetic death metal album. It's definitely a step up from the self-titled, so I won't put it on the not for me tier because I do actually like listening to this one, but definitely need to leave some space above it for some of their later stuff because they have some really good albums that come after this one. Alright, so later in 1996, Asphyx would actually release their fifth album, Embrace the Death. This album was actually recorded before The Rack and was originally supposed to be the group's debut album, but it was never released. Century Media eventually acquired the rights to it, and they would release it. I was debating whether or not to even include this in the ranking list, because it kind of falls into a similar situation as Morbid Angel with Abominations of Desolation, where you had an album that was recorded as the debut, but not released until years later. Kind of similar to that album, you have several songs on Embrace the Death that were re-recorded for subsequent albums, like the track Streams of Ancient Wisdom, which appeared on Last One on Earth. That said, unlike Abominations of Desolation, I haven't seen any Asphyx members say that Embrace the Death should be considered a demo, so I will go ahead and include it in my ranking list. For some context here, this album includes Theo Lumens on vocals, along with Eric Daniels on guitar, and Bob Bagchis on drums. Theo here almost sounds nothing like he did on God Cries, and instead uses more of a garbled death growl that actually sounds more like the performance on the self-titled album. Generally speaking, the music on Embrace the Death is very rough, raw, and slow death doom that again sounds a lot like old Paradise Lost. The production is particularly rough here, with guitars that even cut out a little bit at times, times, making this feel almost more like a demo than a proper album. I do like how raw this album feels, but stylistically, I think this music just doesn't really resonate with me a whole lot. I would definitely prefer what Asphyx would start doing on The Rack and Last One on Earth as compared to Embrace the Death. The other thing too is personally I would rather listen to the re-recorded versions of some of these songs that would appear on later albums. I can understand why people would enjoy Embrace the Death, but to me, it's kind of just for hardcore completionists or Death Doom fans only. Not really something I reach for when I want to listen to Asphyx. I'll put it in the not for me tier, and I'd actually put it a little bit below the self-titled album because I think the self-titled had a little bit more polish to it and a little bit cooler atmosphere going on. So in 1996, after releasing those two records, Asphyx would actually split up, but Bob Bagchis and Eric Daniels would start a new project called Soulburn, which they formed with Pinnacle vocalist and bassist Wannis Gubbles. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Soulburn would release an album called Feeding on Angels in 1998 before deciding to change their name to Asphyx in 1999, which effectively reactivated Asphyx. And this lineup would record and release the sixth Asphyx album, On the Wings of Inferno, which came out in 2000. So continuing from God Cries, On the Wings of Inferno is generally a faster album compared to some of the others, although you do have some nice grooves here too. I think generally speaking, this is just a step up in a lot of ways from God Cries. The production, for example, is their best yet, with a really thick and meaty guitar sound. The riffing is generally more interesting to me than the self-titled album and God Cries as well. I love the heavy tremolos that appear throughout, for example. And then the opening track, Summoning the Storm, has some really great mid-tempo riffs and really great groovy riffs that call back to some of the better moments from the first two albums. Several songs here also take a little bit more influence from what sounds like Florida death metal to me. Waves of Fire, for example, almost sounds like something from Death's Spiritual Healing album, but mixed with a little bit of that Asphyx groove. Then you have the track Indulge in Frenzy, which is a fast banger with some nice twisted riffing. I also like Wannis' vocals here. He has a high register rasp that's kind of similar to Martin Van Drunen, but I think he does enough of his own thing that it doesn't feel like he's trying to copy Martin Van Drunen's approach. That being said, there are definitely some things about On the Wings of Inferno that I don't love as much. For one thing, this album has kind of an interesting structure with generally longer and more mid-tempo songs in the first half of the record, and then generally shorter and faster songs in the second half, which to me just makes it feel a little bit unbalanced. There's also not a whole lot of material here as well. The album's about 29 minutes in length, and while it has 9 songs, one of those songs is an acoustic instrumental, and then the closing track is basically an extended outro with this repeating riff and some spoken word, which is a pretty neat way to end the album, but I think I just would have liked a few more proper songs on this album. That said, there's definitely a lot of inspired riffing here, some great performances. It's a really fun and enjoyable album. Definitely the best of their mid-period, I would say, but still not on the level of their first two. I'll put it in the great stuff tier because this is a really enjoyable album. But again, I still want to leave some room above it for some of their later albums because they've had some really great stuff come out in the past 15 years. So Asphyx would actually split up in the year 2000, but a few years later, due to calls for them to play festivals, they would eventually reform in the year 2007 with Martin Van Drunen coming back on vocals, Bob Bagchis coming back on drums, and Wannis Gubbles returning on bass. Eric Daniels would actually not return on guitar. Instead, they would recruit Paul Bayans, who is also known for his work in the bands Thanatos and Hail of Bullets. With this lineup, they would play a few live shows and eventually release their comeback album, Death the Brutal Way, in 2009. I think the band really came back strong with this one. Scorbutics, for example, is an amazing opener with some absolutely massive groovy riffing. This is easily in the top 10 best Asphyx songs. In terms of the rest of the album, this feels stylistically similar to the first two albums with a pretty solid mix of faster moments, groovier moments, and doomier moments. Yet at the same time, the production is a lot more modern on Death the Brutal Way, with this crisp, clear, and powerful sound provided by Dan Swano. I think with how blunt Asphyx's riffing is, that production just really makes these riffs pop out, and fortunately you have plenty of strong riffing here. The track The Herald, for example, has some chuggy riffs that mix really well with the almost oceanic sounding leads. Then you have Eisenbaum Morser, which has this fast and almost melodic riff coupled with these big grooves. I love the cannon sample and shout of fire in this song as well. The title track is just a thrash attack with a massive stomp that just smashes my head in. The self-aware lyrics are a little bit weird, but whatever. I also think there's some good variety on Death the Brutal Way. Asphyx 2, for example, leans more into the band's doomier elements with some strained riffing that builds into these harmonious leads. I will say, though, this song is a little bit too long and sluggish for my taste, and that kind of leads me into one of the issues I have with this album, and that's the fact that there are a lot of doomy and slower portions incorporated into many of these songs, and at times that kind of makes what would otherwise be a really great song just drag a little bit. The track Cape Horn, for example, has this doomy opening passage that is kind of neat, but also just feels a little bit tiresome to me coming so late in the runtime after we've already heard so much slower tempo material. The closing instrumental song, which is also a little slower, just feels superfluous to me too, especially given this record is already almost 49 minutes long. Because of moments like that, I think the second half of this record just drags just a little bit. My final quibble is that I think some of these tracks just drag on a little too long, like the song Black Hole Storm. That being said, that's really me searching for stuff to complain about. There's so many great songs and riffs on this record. It's great to have Martin back on vocals. He sounds just as good, if not better, than he did on the first two albums. And for me, this was a huge step up from the prior albums, and this was the closest they had come at this point in their career to reclaiming the glory of the first two albums. Still not quite on the fantastic tier, but definitely on the great stuff tier. Really enjoyable album, and definitely a strong comeback. So following Death the Brutal Way, Wannis would actually leave the band, and they would get Alwyn Zur on bass. The group would then release their 8th album in 2012, entitled Deathhammer. Deathhammer definitely feels like a refinement of the sound you heard on the prior album, and to me, this is the record where their modern sound just really clicked. The biggest change compared to the last album is the inclusion of a lot more shorter and faster songs here. This approach definitely works well, especially on the title track, which is by far the band's most popular song on Spotify, and it's easy to see why. The track is basically just this short, crusty assault with these hammering chords and this shout-along chorus of "Bow down to the death hammer." I also just love the way this song starts with this shout of "This is true death metal, you bastards!" Generally speaking, I would say on Deathhammer, the songwriting also just feels tighter to me. The opening track, Into the Time Waste, for example, mixes tremolos with this awesome groove. I feel like if you had a song like this on Death the Brutal Way, you would have like a minute or two of doomy stuff going on, but here they just cut that out. That really goes for a lot of these songs too. Rather than having songs that have slower moments, the doomier moments are kind of segregated into their own tracks, which I think works pretty well here. We Doom You to Death, for example, is one of those doomier songs that has this melodic riff that meshes really well with the vocals during the chorus and makes for a pretty neat cut. Also like the closing track, As the Magma Mammoth Rises, which is another doomy song that has these particularly mighty riffs. In terms of other standouts, I really enjoy the track The Flood, which I think does a great job showing Martin Van Druenen's vocal prowess, especially with how his vocal patterns just match with kind of the grooviness of the music on this song. The sequencing of Deathhammer is also great. I like how you usually have a few faster and shorter songs, and then a doomier and slower and longer song just to kind of break it up. The one thing I will say is I think some of the slower tracks on Deathhammer, like the song Minefield and Dare Lanzer, they just go on a little long. I think these songs could have said what they needed to say in 5 minutes instead of 7 minutes or more. That said, that's pretty much my only criticism about Deathhammer. This record seems to be a fan favorite, and it's easily one of my favorites as well. Definitely one of the better death metal albums of the 2010s, an absolutely stellar record. Goes in the fantastic tier. Not quite at the level of the first two albums for me, but very, very close. Right, so following Deathhammer, Bob Bagchish would actually leave the band, leaving Asphyx in the interesting position of having no original members. Nonetheless, that wouldn't stop the band from continuing, and they would recruit drummer Stefan Huskins, who's probably most famous for being the longtime drummer for the German black thrash band Disaster. This lineup shift apparently resulted in some delays since Huskins lives in Germany while the rest of the band lives in the Netherlands, which apparently made it a little hard to get together and rehearse. But nonetheless, the group would eventually return in 2016 with their 9th album, Incoming Death. Incoming Death definitely follows the general template of Deathhammer with a lot of short, fast songs interspersed with longer and doomier cuts. Just like the last album, the title track on this album is a fast and crusty song, which feels like the spiritual successor to the title track from the last record. I think the biggest difference between Incoming Death and Deathhammer to me is that a lot of the songs on Incoming Death just feel a lot more direct. The opening track, Kandiru, for example, I think only has like 3 riffs, but it's got a great mix of the more high energy stuff coupled with his really great groovy riff that comes in. Division Brandenburg is the follow-up song, and that's another great track that mixes these slower tempos with great grooves. It Came From the Skies is one of my personal favorite Asphyx songs, and almost sounds like a faster version of Scorbutics from the Death the Brutal Way album. I love the groovy riffs on this song, and I also love those dramatic chords that you get as Martin Van Druenen shouts, "It came from the skies!" The other thing I like about Incoming Death is that the doomier songs generally feel a little bit shorter, and they feel more engaging to me too than those on the prior album. The Grand Denial, for example, has some real crunchy riffs and epic leads. Then I love the way you have these mellow and almost pretty sounding guitars that end the song. The other cool thing about Incoming Death is that some of the songs feel a little different than anything the band had done previously. The Feeder, for example, in spite of its somewhat silly lyrics, really stands out to me just for the way it barrels along this almost punky pace. Forerunners of the Apocalypse is another great song that moves along with some quick quick grooves and features some layered chords that are really neat. I've seen a lot of people say that Incoming Death is a step down from Deathhammer, but I really don't agree with that. I actually think Incoming Death is slightly more memorable and has even more standout songs than Deathhammer did. That said, I do think Deathhammer had a little bit more depth and a little bit more atmosphere to it as well. These two are pretty much neck and neck to me, and it's only personal preference that leads me to rank Incoming Death higher, but both fantastic albums, both absolutely essential listens for any fans of the band, and two of the best death metal records to come out in the 2010s in my book. Alright, so following Incoming Death, we would have a 5-year gap, but Asphyx would eventually return with their latest album, 2021's Necroceros. Necroceros is an interesting record. There's a lot of great songs here, but the biggest difference between this and their other post-reunion albums is that this is really dominated by a lot of mid-tempo material. The only real faster songs on this album are the opening track, The Soul Cure is Death, and the song Botox Implosion, which kicks off the second half of the album. Both these songs are amazing. The Soul Cure is Death has this neat winding riff during the chorus that I really like. And then Botox Implosion has these fast and urgent riffs, and then this mid-tempo thrash break that's just awesome. That said, other than these two songs, a lot of these tracks really cruise along at the same tempo. Mount Skull, for example, is just this big, lumbering mid-tempo song. And then it's followed by Knights Templar Stand, which has a great opening riff, but every time it starts, I just feel like I think it would have been better if Knights Templar Stand had followed a song that didn't have such a similar tempo to it. That's pretty much a recurring issue throughout this record to me. The Nameless Elite and Yield or Die, for example, both have some really powerful riffing, but I think they would have just sounded stronger if the songs around them had not been so similar in tempo. That said, though, while I'm usually not the hugest fan of the band's more doomy material, I think it does really stand out here. 3 Years of Famine, in particular, really has these epic and mournful leads that I love. The closing title track also just feels absolutely massive. I mean, for all my complaints about the tempo, I really do like this album a lot. This was one of my favorite records of 2021. And there's so many great individual songs here, but I just think in terms of the structure of the album, a little bit of tweaking or maybe a faster song or two really would have helped this be on the level of Incoming Death and Deathhammer. In terms of where it sits in the ranking, this to me is really, really close to Death the Brutal Way. And in fact, I think these are actually both better than On the Wings of Inferno, so I'll bump On the Wings of Inferno down to the pretty good tier, which I think is fair. Now, in terms of which one is better between Death the Brutal Way and Necroceros, I think I'll say Death the Brutal Way, because while that album did drag a little bit at times, I think overall it was just slightly more enjoyable. But pretty much everything on these top 3 tiers are neck and neck in my book. But yeah, that's my Asphyx ranking, and what a great band this is. I'd love to see them live sometime. Apparently they haven't come to the US since 2017, so maybe we'll be seeing them soon. And hopefully we're getting some new material from them soon, because as they showed with their post-reunion material, they still can release some really great stuff. But that's all for this one, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think of Asphyx. Let me know what you think of my ranking. And if you like this video, please drop me a like, please subscribe. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week. Stay heavy.